thank you ever so much both for being here today. One of the things that we're obviously trying to do as a system is try and support people to understand what designing curriculum looks like in Curriculum for Wales. And you've both been part of the pilot Understanding by Design project. So really what we wanted to do is just kind of set out for listeners who have potentially not had the opportunity to be involved in the pilot, what has that meant? What does it look like? And how is that manifesting itself in your school? So we really just want to kind of have a bit of a chat this afternoon just to think about what does that look like? How can we support other people across the system to just think about what's helping them at the moment? So really, really grateful to Claire and Mark, who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves in a moment, for joining me this afternoon. And really, if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and your context of your school and the reason for why you took part in this pilot. So I'm going to come to you, Claire, first, if I can.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire Pritchard. I'm head teacher at Carrigover Primary School, which is in Llanymynech, which is right at the north of Powys, and we border with England. Actually, the main road that runs through our village, the other side of the road is in England, so very close to the border. We've got 99 pupils in our school, split over 4 classes with a 14% FSM. And we're a very busy little school who's enjoying implementing the new curriculum.
Fabulous. Thanks, Claire. That's great. And Mark, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your context, please?
Yeah, I'm Mark, and I'm deputy head at Raglan Primary School in Monmouthshire. And we're in quite a leafy setting in lovely rural Monmouthshire. We're a single form entry, around 170 to 180 children on roll. And really, as a school, we're fairly unique in that we have a plaza setting. So we don't have any classrooms. We have shared learning spaces between 2 or 3 age groups.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. It's got 2 different contexts, both potentially on different borders of what it is that we're talking about. And I'm sure we'll come to that a little bit later as to how that's implemented. So in terms of just thinking about your reason for joining the pilot of Understanding by Design, we obviously had an opportunity in DISC in December 2022 to work with Jay McTighe, US author of Understanding by Design, to get us a little bit more au fait with the idea of backwards planning and the process of backwards design that they use. So Claire, can I ask you first, what made you think that this might be something that was appropriate to join through your school?
We like to explore different concepts and things that are going on with regard to the new curriculum, and we saw the advert and we thought that it sounded quite interesting with the backwards design and using the learning as the main focus, which is something that we've implemented a lot here. And so I did a little bit of research about Jay McTighe, and then applied for the course, which is a really interesting opportunity.
Thank you. And Mark, similar question to you really, and I understand kind of you were already familiar with some of Jay's work previously. What made you think as if this actually might enhance that learning for you as opposed to be a duplication?
I think personally for me, I'd already been aware of Jay through my initial teacher training and just my own reading, really. I'd sort of come across his work and that backwards design concept. We've been on our journey since about 2019, and I felt like as a school we needed to look at our next step. And when the UBD pilot came along, that seemed like the natural next step for us to take, because we've been doing a lot of this on our own, essentially, within our own school. And I saw it as a great opportunity, not only to actually get to interact with Jay in the flesh, albeit virtually, but it was also a nice opportunity to work with other schools and see what was going on in other settings, everyone with a like mind in that sense as well.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Because I think one of the things that we've been really careful with the pilot all the way through is to say, by no means are we suggesting this is a design model suitable for Curriculum for Wales. But those of us that have been involved in the pilot are testing that as a concept to think about whether the ideas of backward design can actually help us move from the kind of outcome and output model of what we've had of planning lessons previously to thinking about how we design curriculum as potentially a new skill for us. And I would imagine for both of you describing some of those smaller settings, that's really crucial when actually the workload manifestations of teachers being able to do that, a way of being able to sensibly do that, I think is very much needed. So we're going to think a little bit more now about kind of your experiences of the pilot so far. And Mark, I'm going to come to you first if I can. When you said that you were already familiar with that work, what is it that's that you've discovered that potentially has helped you, or you wish had been done differently to help you further from being involved in the initial parts of the pilot?
I think for myself, the understanding of backwards design broadly was already there. What the pilots brought to me is the understanding of how you develop that foundation of really meaningful planning for understanding. So starting with a concept and building that concept beyond a coverage approach and a knowledge approach, and looking more at what's the point, what's the purpose, why are we doing this, where are we going with it from the outset? Because I've always been someone who's planned with that goal of, right, what are we going to do at the end? But I think my own learning, and that as a result of the staff as I was leading it, I didn't have that really solid foundation in where that came from in the first place. So the pilot has filled that gap perfectly. It's really plugged that hole and given that more fully rounded understanding of what UBD is.
Thank you. That's really useful perspective on it, because one of the things, I suppose, if I come to you, Claire, now, we've spoken about previously is about that building blocks around conceptual understanding as a design mechanism was something that you've been working on in your school for quite some time. So what does that look like in your school, and how has kind of that led you to the UBD pilot?
We've done a lot of work as teaching staff to make sure that the learning that we put in place is based around what the children need to learn. And so there's each individual child has their specific learning goals, and that's taken from their work, looking back, reflecting and building their next steps. So when we're planning for the next term or the next I don't like to use the word topic, we have a guided question approach, but we look at where the children are at, what are their next steps in their learning and where they need to go, and that's where we lead our planning from. And also we do look at, local things that are going on locally and build all of those within the next steps of our planning.
One of the things that you mentioned there was that idea of kind of the deep learning that's relevant to your learners and how you identify those. When we the first session that we had with Jay himself, he talked an awful lot about those kind of long-lasting transfer goals and talked about that real depth of meaning. So has that been something that's been helpful to you, or something that you think would have helped earlier on in your thinking in your own school?
Yeah, the depth is really crucial, and it's the challenges that we're getting is making sure that the children are aware of their depth of learning, to make sure that it's not just surface level, that they're going deeper than that, and it's in their long-term memory, they can recall it. So it's about building all those layers within their progress, so that it's not just, as I said, surface level, just touch on recounts, touch on this, touch on that. They've really got to get that depth knowledge so that they can recall it and use it when they need it.
Brilliant, thank you. And Mark, I can see you kind of nodding along there, and I know that your experiences that you've talked about with your own staff is a bit of a mind shift change, and I wonder whether you might be able to kind of share with us some of the ways in which you've kind of supported that with professional learning in your school.
My fault entirely at the start of our process with our curriculum development, in that I made lots of assumptions about where our staff were and how comfortable and confident our staff were feeling with it. And the journey we've been through and the work we've done with the pilot has just clarified that whenever you're developing a curriculum, you can't make those assumptions about staff's background experiences, what they've experienced before they've come to your school, what their training was like. And the concept of transfer goals will be the biggest shift for us, because that's what we're going to really tackle next. In that, yes, we need to think about those long-term goals, and we need to think about the purpose, but the journey towards that point, we've had to do lots of circular trips back to our starting points. It wasn't a linear journey for us. We started off with a process, with a structure that we'd set out consistently across the school, but everyone's understanding over time changed. So we've had to take lots of pit stops, circle back, revisit things, come back together as a staff. The key thing I think for us with the staff and their development has been setting aside professional learning time towards the end of a term to just get together in a room and talk about the planning for the term that's coming up, bounce ideas around, make sure that everyone's at the same point in terms of their understanding of our process. And fortunately, we've developed a really open culture where the staff will just go, I don't understand that, can someone explain that to me? I'm not too sure about this bit, can I just ask a question? And that's been the biggest shift, where we've all just sat together and gone, right, what is it we're doing? How do we do it? And if I'm feeling a bit vulnerable, that's okay, I can ask questions and get support.
We just tend to keep going, don't we, and wanting to do the next thing and moving on, but it's really important to reflect back as well.
And it's not about that coverage aspect, it's about what have you actually taught, what have they learned, what have they understood, and is it okay to move on, or do we need to revisit and develop something further?
Yeah, definitely.
Claire, can I ask then, because when you picked up that seemed to kind of strike a chord with you there, about what has been the kind of journey of you and your staff in your school about coming back to moving away from that kind of task and finish mentality that we've perhaps survived on for quite some time. How has that changed in your school about the way people are approaching these things?
I'm really lucky that I've had the same staff for about 10 years. So that I would imagine, makes a really big difference because we just know each other so well. But it is all about that cycle, that spiral that Mark was talking about, that, you do make mistakes, but go back, and you learn from those mistakes. I'm a big believer in trial and improvement, right? So that it's a positive journey that we're on, and that we're open as a staff to change. So we trial things, some things work, some things don't, but it's always with the best interest of the children and their progress, and making sure that journey is right for them.
It sounds really to me as if actually you both invested an awful lot in the culture of your schools in order to ensure that people feel comfortable, able to change that mindset. I wonder whether there's something there about the way in which you can kind of talk to people about perhaps some of the steps along the way, about what it is that you've noticed along the way, about how that's worked.
I think for us personally, it's been the staff, lots of the staff had a moment where they realised that for a long time they'd been teaching for coverage and because it was in a scheme of work, and they hadn't necessarily been teaching for a purpose. And initially they found identifying that purpose to be quite challenging, and it was a bit confronting and a bit uncomfortable and left us scratching our heads. And there was no quick solution to that. It was simply constantly, always, when we're having those conversations, going back to, but why? What are you aiming for the children to get out of that? What is the point? And it was just simply through dialogue. I wish there was a magic wand you could wave to make it quicker, but it was simply hard work, the staff really committing wholeheartedly to it, and credit to them, they really have, and feeling that vulnerability and going for it. But it's just simply time, dialogue, and the willingness, as Claire said, the willingness to try and for it not to go right first time, and that to be done in a safe way, not in a sort of punitive way that you think you're going to get in trouble. As an SLT member myself, we're all on board with that, and we're all supportive of the staff with that, and the head teachers at all our meetings when we do these discussions. And that's key to the culture and that change, the knowledge that you've got the support and the backup there as well, and it's supported change rather than taking a big risk and something terrible happening if it doesn't work out.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think for us, what I've had to work on is not slipping back into those comfort zones, because it's very easy to slip back into your topic and thinking, oh, we could do this and we could do that. But it's just keeping that dialogue going of why are we wanting to this? What do we want our children to learn? And what do they need to learn next for their learning journey?
I think as well, it's something that's occurred to us and we have to keep coming back to, is we need to do less, but do that less significantly better. Yes, you might have been able to fill 12 weeks in the past with every fact you could possibly think of about the Egyptians, but did it make a significant difference? They might have had a lovely time, but
Yeah.
did it really deepen their understanding? Did it really impact on their broader skills across the curriculum? And hand on heart, I can say probably for my teaching it didn't. So now it's a case of, okay, we can have all these big ideas to start with, but let's really then distill that down to something that is going to be achievable and impactful and the most effective way we can do it.
Yeah, definitely quality over quantity.
Totally.
Now, you've also both talked there very eloquently about the power of kind of collaboration and professional dialogue there as well. And I just wonder whether equally you might be able to share with us the kind of practical side of how you've managed to make that work in your school, because it's clearly having an impact on the confidence of your staff to trial these ideas in a safe space that you've created, and whether there's something there that you'll be able to share with people.
So for us, it's ensuring those staff meetings happen regularly, and that there's time within those staff meetings that we can discuss and reflect. We use some of Lynn Sharrett's techniques within our staff meeting, which makes us reflect on individual children. And so that gets us to have a whole understanding as a staff of the children within our school. But then also the discussions about the learning that they're taking on. And it's challenging because you get all into the conversations of the broken computer and all of those things that, you know, take over. But it's making sure that those don't take away from that time that's really specific for us. And then mapping out professional learning, but professional learning, not just a course. It's making sure, you know, it's been challenging, but giving them opportunities to discuss with other practitioners. We have AOLE networks here in Powys that making sure that the staff have opportunities to access those, and then they hear the different messages from different places, and that helps to kind of cement in what we're talking about as a staff, gives them the confidence in what we're doing.
I think for our in terms of our collaboration, what we've really benefited from is when we've developed our approach to the curriculum, we've developed thematic planning journals because we wanted to maximize on the teacher agency bit of the new curriculum, the potential it gives for that. But we were also mindful of we still need to work together as a team. We still need to be consistent. We still need to be able to support each other. And we broke our structure down into some very simple basic words of things like what, why, really broke it down step by step. So we've got almost a new dialogue for our curriculum. We've got our new vocabulary that we can talk about together, that we can do it in a staff meeting, we can do it in teams, we can do it individually one-to-one, and we can all start to develop this common dialogue that we've got about what our new curriculum looks like. And that structure is giving us all something to hold on to. So I know you can talk in shorthand now. It could be someone coming to you saying, right, I need to talk to you about my what. And then you've already got the start of this new language that we need to use. And that's bringing us closer together as we unpick what that means, what you'd include in that part of your planning process, where that's come from, and the thinking behind it. So I would completely agree with Claire. You've got to give the time to it. You've got to give professional learning time, and like you said, that isn't necessarily attending a course or going somewhere. For us, it's being together in the same room with nothing else to talk about but our planning and our curriculum. No other distractions, no diary dates, all of that kind of stuff. Just talking about the nuts and bolts of what we do. In fact, one of our sections in our thematic planning journal is called Nuts and Bolts, because we wanted to make it that simple and that obvious. So it's having a consistent structure for us, but then coming together to work around that consistent structure, which really builds our collaboration, I think.
I think people need that basic, simple structure, don't they, to give them that security to move forward. And that consistent approach just gives that the basics for them all.
It's a bit of a safety net.
Yeah.
That you think, well, if I've done this and this and this and this and this, I'm on the right track.
Yeah,
I'm going in the right direction.
I think that's what we've all kind of been wanting with the new curriculum, isn't it? That, you know, especially with assessment and progression, you know, they just, is this the right direction kind of thing? So it gives your staff that security, doesn't it?
I think for me, that you've hit the nail on the head there. For me, being part of the UBD pilot has done that for me personally. because I felt a degree of pressure thinking, well, I've done this reading, I've done this research, and I've come up with this way we're doing it in school. Am I just going a bit rogue, and is this right? But actually, talking to lots of other schools through the pilot and hearing from Jay himself, then you're thinking, oh, okay, right, yeah, we're okay, we're doing all right.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. I think in terms of our approach to planning, that from the pilot, what we've done in terms of tweaking and developing it further has been, we're not going to use the UBD planning framework as is. You know, there's the template that comes along with it. We're not going to use that because that doesn't fit with how we've developed it so far. But what we are going to use is take the key questions out and then build them into our process. So those essential questions, key questions, they've gone straight in at the early stages of our planning framework. When we get to our what, it's okay, so what are your essential questions you're going to develop? So it's not in the UBD box that it should be on the framework, but it's now built into our process. Further through, when we're thinking about transfer goals, we've built that in as a regular point to come back to keep revisiting our transfer goals. So that's always in your mind as you work through our planning process. So it has been a case of tweaking our process to transform it rather than encountering UBD in its pure form, I suppose, and going, we must do this exactly as it is. We've just got to take it off the shelf from the book and apply it to our school. What we've done before, that's not right. Let's get rid of that and let's start afresh. It's been a case of, we got lots of agreed principles here that are the same. The UBD pilot is enhancing it by just putting those tweaks in and giving those opportunities to stop, think and reflect and understand what we mean by some of the terminology. So that's been where I've seen the biggest impact on our in-school processes coming directly from the pilot.
I think it'd probably be fair to say that, you know, as we've kind of talked with other schools that are part of the pilot as well, there has been that need for, as you said, that bit of a safety blanket. And I know, you know, I shared my experience. I was that teacher who needed to have everything in the planner, and that made me feel better. And regardless of whether my children were learning, it was lesson 8 in the scheme of work and it was in my planner, I was going with it. And I think it's certainly offered me the opportunity, and similar to you, Mark, in my own school, was thinking, I don't know whether this is right, but I haven't necessarily come across anything else that's allowing people to see this in a way that gives them the comfort and the structure that's there. So there's two things really that I wanted to pull on really that both of you talked about. There was something there that both of you shared about a shared language, and you both talked about kind of developing that shared language within your own staff in your own context. But Claire, you also talked about how that helps people to understand what else they were kind of being a part of in your case in Powys. And I wonder whether if Claire, I come to you first, how have you kind of developed that language that allows people to develop that confidence both inside your school and across your schools?
Well, that's something that we're looking at now as part of our cluster, to get that shared language to support the children, because at the end of the day it's always coming back to the children, because at the moment there's learning objectives, intentions and WALTs and WILFs and all of these different things, and for the children joining in together in high school, some consistency there is really important for them. But from our staff point of view, it's Powys have got quite a consistent approach in place for their planning. For Powys, they've got the AOLE networks where they have their pedagogical leads supporting, and that's quite a nice system that they've got in place, because the pedagogical leads are teachers that are actually going through the process at the moment, and they're feeding back to the network leaders and things in Powys to support them in their development. And they've got quite a tight process to follow for the introduction of new curriculum. Still very much you can adapt and make it your own, but it's given you that basic outline, if you like, to support us. And so that's made, when we talk to other schools, more of a consistent approach. But it is still something that we're looking at to develop even further to get that shared understanding.
Thank you. Because I think it's fair to say it's kind of, it's the next part of the jigsaw for each person as we're going through. Every so often you think, right, I've cracked it, I've got a good understanding, and then something else might challenge that understanding, and it's just taking the next kind of baby step forward. Mark, you mentioned your kind of idea of a shared language that gives people an opportunity to have a structure if it's helpful, but not something that kind of binds them. And I wonder whether you might be able to kind of just elaborate a little bit more on how you've done that.
Yeah, it's a structure of about 8 different areas, just to, again, to give that consistency, so, and to help with the process of planning. But what we found is that the staff developed that understanding of, yeah, okay, so these are the steps we're going to follow. We're going to start off thinking about the national level and what we need to address as a country. We're going to think about the school development plan. We're going to think about the needs of the cohort. That's our starting point, and then that's going to branch off into what our theme's going to be across the term, and then how we're going to do that. And we were understanding that. What I found with our staff, the gap was, and where people were feeling a bit overwhelmed, was, okay, I understand this process, but how do I build in all these other bits of the curriculum that I've got? How do I make it make sense? Because I've got this over here and this over there, and how do I do it? So ultimately, this academic year, we created essentially a planning guide, which links directly through to all the relevant Curriculum for Wales documents, all the relevant frameworks at the right point in the process. So, for example, when they're coming up with some aspects of what they're going to cover, we've linked through to things like the DARPL website, so that they get straight to that information. It doesn't involve them searching and going anywhere. It pulls it together, so that alongside our developing language of what it means for us in our school, we've pieced together then, okay, so this bit of our planning process, that calls upon that bit of the curriculum, this bit of hub, this bit of the frameworks. This next bit, you might want to go and have a look at the OECD website to give you some background to that. You might want to go and read some Estin thematic reports to feed into that. And then that's just sort of started to bring all these, in some cases, disparate bits of information together, and it's unified our planning process with the documentation and the guidance that goes behind that to support it. And again, lots of the staff went, oh, right, this is great. That makes sense now. This is starting to come together. And we're not there yet. We're still on a developing journey with that. And even since I've been in the pilot, we've added a few extra bits in here or there, a bit more guidance, a bit more support. But that's been how we've, I suppose, developed that shared language and that understanding more. We've taken our language and then we've married it up with what does this mean nationally and where is it coming from?
And I think it would be fair to say that one of the things that, you know, Welsh Government obviously published in June 22 was the supporting materials that helps people to navigate some of those things through Hub. And I think lots of practitioners are talking to us about when you're looking for something specific, it can be sometimes a bit difficult to find quickly. And what we then found was that lots of people have on the pilots, quite regularly people will talk to us about how they've adapted the principles of backward design towards a planning framework that supports their own school, and equally like yourself would actually take those national objectives against their school improvement objectives too, so that they're making it applicable to them. And I think it's fair to say that that's kind of what we're trying to do, is navigate that tightrope between a national framework and ensuring that as a local curriculum it fits the needs of our learners and our individual context too. And again, we have that idea of the habits and the backwards design habits to think differently about the way in which potentially we established teachers who have perhaps been doing this slightly too long are in a position where we're changing the way in which our mindset works. Our measure of success and our professional identity of planning is changing, and you've got to be able to support people with that. If I can now kind of take us a little bit back to sharing with people, what is the pilot? How does it work? We've obviously got access to the author himself, and he's going to be working across our 12 sessions. We've got 3 sessions with Jay himself, but there's also a range of asynchronous materials that we've had access to. And I wonder whether you might be able to kind of just tell us a little bit about how you and your staff member that is equally with you is being able to navigate that.
I've really responded well to the Institute, the asynchronous approach, because it's got a nice variety of learning activities within it. Sometimes I've done asynchronous learning courses and various other activities, and it's been work through the slides or watch the video of someone's slides, and after a while, if you haven't clicked with it, it can be sort of be painful. Whereas with the Institute, because you've got things like discussion boards and the fact that the rest of your colleagues on the pilot are also going to see that, that's interesting because you see other people's ideas. Then you've got those individual reflection spaces. You've got things like the use of the Padlet, and I just like the format that's been put together to get you to think and to get you to communicate your thoughts. And the clips that are of Jay are just long enough to give you that little seed to think, right, yes, I've got that now, before you go on and you think more deeply about your own setting or your own process. So that has worked particularly well for me. And I know my colleague who's been working on it, we've been working on it at different rates. And that's another bonus because you can go at your own pace. You can go back and you can revisit bits. You can watch bits again if you didn't quite pick it up the first time. But it's worked really well for both of us. And then we found ourselves doing it separately, but coming together and having a discussion about what we'd experienced and what it would mean for our school and our process and the way we were going to interpret it. So I think it's been a really valuable opportunity to have the time to talk together within the team space with other colleagues, in person, as far as we can manage that, but then to go away and look at the materials and to reflect purely on your own school and your own setting and your own skills. It's just been, I've been really enjoying it. It's been great.
Thank you. And Claire, how has that been for you and your setting?
So it's an easy system to use, and I agree with what Mark said. There's lots of variety within it, and pick it up when you want to. And yeah, very much like what Mark said, really, the fact that then it brings discussion points back to us for staff, and it's deepening the team session. It's deepening your knowledge then as you progress further into it.
I think one of the things that I suppose when we were kind of thinking about how we would structure the pilot that is difficult to do is to protect that time for teachers as well. And obviously we've got various sessions that allow people to talk with others that are on that pilot. But I wonder whether you would just be able to share whether it's helpful or not in terms of the protection of the time and the time to complete the asynchronous material, how that perhaps has worked for you. And you mentioned there the colleagues that are also with you. Does that give you time to talk with them and think about how that applies in your setting? Or is there something else that you would think, actually, if we did that again, I'd find this even more helpful? And whether Claire, I come to you first for that one.
I think given the allocation of time, I wasn't expecting it to start off with, so that's where I had to kind of rethink it. But I do think it's important that it is there, because like we all know, we're all so busy, and it'll just be, I'll do it later kind of thing. So always, like we do with our staff meetings, making sure that time is there is really important.
Mark, how is it? You mentioned there in terms of your kind of collaboration with your colleague and working at a different pace. How has that kind of impacted how that works for you as a school?
Increasingly, as we've gone through the pilot, it's really benefited having that protected time within the session then as part of the session, because when we've broken away to go and work on the Institute and to work through those activities, after about, I'd say, sort of half an hour, 40 minutes or so of that, we've made progress to the point that we're going to do individually, and then we naturally come back together and we have our conversation there and then, whilst it's still fresh and it's still buzzing around in our head, and we can bounce ideas around. So, but again, that's within that protected time. So having that mix of talking to colleagues outside, working on your own and reflecting on your own, and then talking to colleagues within your own setting, it feels like the perfect combination, really. I come away from those conversations thinking, right, I know where we're going now. That's our next thing. This is our next step.
So thinking about kind of where we would go next then with this, I wonder whether now you might be able to just, as I said, very honestly share whatever it is that you think this is still quite difficult. This is still challenging us. This is still a little bit tricky. And some of the things that either the pilot might be able to support with as we kind of go through our 12 weeks, or whether things that we might be able to raise for a system for consideration for us to think these are the things that we found would be most valuable to us to make our next steps, and whether again there is anything that's similar or different across your schools that you wanted to discuss with each other.
I think for us the next challenge, and it's not necessarily a challenge because of the nature of it. It's more to do with how long it takes and the time it's going to take us to do this well, but is agreeing the transfer goals. So we see a huge amount of value in taking one AOLE at a time and picking it apart as a staff together, all in the same room, and working out what our core transfer goals are going to be for that AOLE. So we all know we're pulling in that same direction, but that's not going to happen overnight. You know, one AOLE could take a fair few meetings to work through. And then when you move on to things like we discussed science and technology, we'll probably want to identify 3 or 4 transfer goals in each discipline within science and technology, you know, for biology, for chemistry and so on, because otherwise it could be too expansive. So we are literally at the start of that journey now. And for us, it's more a case of having that time to work through it in a really measured, appropriate manner, not feeling pressurized to have it all done by tomorrow, because that's when you don't do it well. But I think the pilot is working well to lay that groundwork for us, particularly with myself and the member of staff who's on that pilot with me. And it's then transferring that knowledge and that level of understanding to the other staff at the same time, if you see what I mean. So I think more broadly, it would be helpful, valuable to make the outcomes of the pilot, whether it's recordings like this or aspects of the institute, maybe available to the other colleagues within the school, so they, you know, you could possibly select things that would be really impactful for them that they could see firsthand as well, rather than getting it secondhand through us. You know, we'll do a good job of it regardless, but just trying to make it as impactful as possible.
Would it be fair to say then that you mentioned kind of the access to the asynchronous materials? If that was something that was available to everybody to work at their own pace, would you change that in any way? Because I suppose one of the things that's tricky is levels of understanding. We talk about this with the children all the time, thinking about assuming that there's levels of understanding, and, you know, we mentioned it ourselves earlier. But there's something about working at your own pace to be able to gain that understanding. But like you've both said, there's also something about going back and forth. So there's something about having something to return back to potentially as well, and whether that might be something that would help as you have new staff and help with people that might have a bit of a wobble every now and again. It's Jay talks about it, it's a difficult framework, but worthwhile.
That's been one of our main challenges. We've had fair amount of staff change over the past couple of years. Like, as I said, we started our curriculum development in 2019, and we've had staff come and go during that period, as you would in many schools. And the challenge has been upskilling those people who come in to understand and be able to interact with and use our approach in our school. Because when you first come across it, you'd be like, whoa, what's this? Because they haven't got that level of understanding. So to have that's part of the reason why we created our guidance document, I suppose, that to support the staff with coming in and picking something up and having a scaffold. But in terms of having access to those really, really good quality professional learning materials through the Institute and recordings, and that would be a great repository of information, I suppose, to keep going back to and just checking in with at your own pace. In terms of delivery of it, I suppose I would see it as we would lead some kind of professional learning with the staff in school about an aspect of it, much like the pilot's been done, you know, eating an elephant one bite at a time, that principle. And I think we would do something together to start that thinking and start that understanding growing, and then pass it over to the staff to have a go now at this unit yourself to see what it means for you, and then we can come back to it and then take our next step. I could see it working really well in that sense.
And transferring your skills that you've learned, you know, if you revisit it yourself, it keeps your focus on it as well, doesn't it, then, to share that with your new staff.
So what kind of continues to challenge you in terms of your curriculum design processes?
Concept mapping is the where we're looking at as a cluster next, and I find it a bit mind-boggling when I just heard Mark even then talking about all the different disciplines and things like that. Just then how you get the balance of that while maintaining the quality over quantity and the consistency across the cluster for us as well. That's the bit that's the cogs are turning for me at the moment to try and get that all straight in my head. In regards to our planning and how we work as a staff, it's really important to us that we review where our children are at the end of our project that we've been working on, so that we review where their learning is at, which then feeds the next steps that we're going to take on board. And so we identify the children's prior knowledge of where they're at and ensure that that's really secure before we move on with our next steps in our learning. We have a structure in place where we have a guiding question, but before we introduce the guiding question to the children, we do surface level learning with the children to ensure that that prior knowledge is in place. And we can start to sow some seeds, if you like, introduce some concepts and things to the children based around what we know as professionals that they need to take their next steps with their learning. And then the guided question is introduced to the children, and from there then the children take ownership of that learning because they've got that base level in place. We used to do introduce a topic, what do you want to learn about it and things, and that it just didn't work. Children didn't know what they needed to learn, so it's really important that we as professionals gave them that base level to start them off on their journey, and that process is working really well. The next steps that we're looking at and exploring is concept mapping, which is something that the cluster want to look at, but it's trying to find a balance with that it doesn't become too structured and too old curriculum, so that we still have that autonomy with our teachers, that we know our children really well, we know their next steps and what's best for their learning journey.
There's something about a manageability there, isn't there? And I know that when we've kind of worked with colleagues as part of the pilot, the ideas are one thing that you can kind of tangibly hold, but we do seem to have a kind of a bit of a way of thinking about things in teaching, that if we commit things to planning documents and paper, then somehow we've managed to kind of achieve a curriculum. And I think the one thing that people are discovering is that there's a way of thinking, and you mentioned the kind of long-term overarching transfer goals and kind of crafting essential questions that are really meaningful. There's a job of work to do there in getting that to be where you want it to be. But there's a danger that we make this a little bit about filling in boxes that we don't need to fill in. And I just wonder whether actually in that sense, Claire, what are you thinking that you need to kind of protect your staff from to make that manageable? And also perhaps we've got to be mindful of as a curriculum that the goal of our curriculum design is not to produce as many progression maps as we can. No. So how do we do that?
And just because I feel that it very easily could take the steps back to a curriculum on a piece of paper, and from my belief is that this new curriculum isn't about that. It's about what our learners need, and we don't know what they're going to need, in a 4-year cycle or whatever we put down on a piece of paper. We don't know what they're going to need, and I'm very cautious about putting things down on a piece of paper that will tie us to this kind of curriculum, the old kind of curriculum again. But I haven't quite got the answers yet to where we go with it.
And Mark, I can see you nodding along there at that point in terms of paperwork, and you mentioned there about you're still developing but do have something that is giving staff confidence. How have you kind of guarded against that not just becoming a filling in of different types of stuff?
I think the development of our thematic planning journals were a reaction to not wanting to have 101 bits of paper, because when we first sat down and thought new curriculum, what are we going to do, we ended up with A3 planners that went on for 4 or 5 pages, and we at one point, myself, the head and another member of staff just looked at each other and said, what are we doing? This is insane. This is meant to be a more exciting, innovative, engaging, purposeful curriculum, and we're just getting really mired in Word documents and whether we can get the column in the right place on the table. So that's when we sort of went, right, enough now, that's going. But we still knew we needed the structure, we needed the support, we needed to give the staff something. So that's where the structure for the journal came along, with the idea that the journal goes with the cohort through the school. So we've still got that degree of security, I suppose, that we're not going to lose the learning that those children have had in terms of documenting it, because the next teacher will see what's gone before, and then the next teacher will see what's gone before that, and so on. So you'll see that journey for that cohort, but then that also makes that journey very unique to that cohort in particular. That's their journey. It's not the scheme of work that you have to follow when you're in year 5 or when you're in year 4. This is their journey. This is where they are now. This is where we'd like them to be, and how are we going to get them there at that point. Recently, we've also done a lot of work with the cluster to start developing some kind of shared understanding across our cluster, so we've got consistency. So far, we've looked at science and humanities in the works now, just to agree really a set of understandings, I suppose, not necessarily in a UBDJ kind of way, but just to have that shared agreement of, yeah, this is what's important in that aspect of science, and this is what's important there. This is what the kind of language we'd like to see. These are the kinds of activities you might do, but on the understanding that we're not all going to do this exactly as it is. This is our guidance document that then each school will personalize to their children in their setting for their needs. So I suppose we've got two-pronged approach. You know, we've got that consistent support. So in our cluster, you can say, well, we've all agreed that this is how science is going to look generally, but then we've also got that element of the freedom that you need, the necessary freedom you need to be able to deliver to the children exactly what they need to continue their development at the same time.
So you've taken us through a kind of pen portrait, if you like, about the approaches that you've taken in terms of planning, and you mentioned their journals. I just wonder whether you might be able to kind of give us a bit of something in your mind's eye about what it is that looks like. What do you mean by journal? How are they used? How are they developed? Just to kind of give people a bit of a visual about what that might look like.
In short, think of it as an artist's spiral bound sketch pad, because that's what they are. That's what we buy them as. Completely blank paper, nice quality paper. Oh, I do like a nice quality paper. And in terms of how the staff complete that, is totally up to them. We've got the structure that on this page we should be able to see that, and then in the next bit we should be able to see that. And so that's our purpose, that's our direction, that's where we're all going consistently. But if you've got a very creative aspect to your personality, you can get all your felt tip pens out and you can get your lovely colored pencils and you can go to town. You can make it look absolutely beautiful. If you're more pragmatic, you can just write a list of the things you're going to do in a mind map. If you want to take bits off the computer and print out, stick it in, just to be a bit more, I suppose, creative in how you put it together. I want a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of that. I'm going to stick it all together on that page. It doesn't matter, as long as two things are happening. You're following the whole school structure, so that whoever looks at it within school, we can go, yeah, we understand that for your class, how it's going. And also it's always available in school, so that the drop of a hat, us as a leadership team or a leader of an AOLE could go, can I just have a quick look at what you're doing? And they're there, because we were also aware that these aren't electronic. So we didn't want someone doing the dog ate my homework and I've left it at home. They need to be in school all the time, because actually it's your planning document. It's something you should be referring back to all the time, and you can scribble on and you can amend, but it's your working document. It's not something that's pristine in a lovely folder with a cover. It's a document that isn't yours either. It's going with that cohort. So that's all it is. Starts off as a blank notebook of lovely paper that we can make even lovelier with our ideas for teaching, learning, and developing their understanding.
Now, Claire, you also talked about that idea of kind of now starting to grapple with the idea of developing concepts over time. And it sounds to me now that really what we're starting to get into the realms of is, how are we using our curriculum design processes to secure progression for learners? And I just wonder whether, Claire, that might be something you want to kind of take us through, what that looks like in your school and your setting, about how you're now mindful of progress with those learners.
For us monitoring progress, we've got in place a learning journal, but that's a bit different to what Mark's talked about. It's an individual, each child has their learning journey. It starts with their baseline from when they enter, and then there's a variety of items within that based around the work that children are doing in class. It's not specific assessment tasks that will be in that journal. It's their real work that they've done at that time. And we also have in place for progression to support the teachers. We have 3 key children per week that the teachers focus on, and they do directed observations on those 3 key children and write their what we call interaction report. That then follows with a meeting with the parents the following week, where the children share their learning progress with the parents and they talk about their next steps. They also feed into their goals, which I mentioned earlier, and they have their individual goals, which they get from looking at their work and their next steps, because it's all about the children identifying their next steps in their learning journey based on what they need. But like I said, that's now got to transfer into the concepts across a cluster, and that's the bit that we've got to battle out with it. But in regards to the progress in school, it's about seeing those children knowing their next steps and no comparisons to others. It's finding their strengths, their weaknesses, and how that we can support them to develop those.
Thank you. Because I think what's really come across, kind of just listen to both of you talk about your approaches to curriculum design, is that the learners are very much at the heart of what it is that you want them to be able to do. But we're also very much mindful that we have to support staff to be able to do that. So that's it's horses for courses. We know there's not going to be one particular way. I think what you've both articulated really well is Mark, you've talked about how from a planning and a curriculum planning point of view, those kind of thinking about the statements of what matters, come in using those elements of the framework, support that planning journey. But it's equally then the case as what you just described, Claire, is that those principles of progression and how a learner becomes more effective and how we get to the heart of are as crucial. And I think we're very much aware that across the country, we've got different schools that have started at different places. They've started with a different part of the framework, but it's just about moving to that next step, and whether this is a pilot or any other way in which we support professional learning helps them to do that. There's no right or wrong way to start, finish, or we'll all keep going with it.
Absolutely.
So it's just for me really to finish by saying a real big thank you to both Claire and Mark for joining with us this afternoon. It's been really, really insightful to learn about your schools, as well as be able to think about how Understanding by Design and how the pilot has supported your thinking.